The Puritans were never that large of a religious group, but they had an absolutely enormous impact on American culture and American history. Uh, and it all began with the influence of this man, John Calvin. He lived in the 16th century, uh, and he was long gone before any Puritans came to the New World, but they were Calvinists. They believed in his teachings. He was one of the main Protestant reformers, a leader of the Protestant Reformation. And his most important theological idea was predestination. Now let's talk about what that means. Calvin said that God started with a covenant of works, an agreement that if humans would live good lives, would perform good works or good deeds, then they would be rewarded with salvation. They would go to heaven, which is what you mean by salvation. But then Adam and Eve sinned, and that, of course, is known as the original sin. And under Calvin, God is an angry God. So he replaced the covenant of works with a covenant of grace. Now, the thing you need to know about grace is that it's freely given. You can't earn it. You get it or you don't. And whether you get it is simply up to God, not to you. Now, I'm telling you what Calvin and the Puritans believed. I'm not saying that I believe it or you should believe it. I'm telling you what they believe. He said that God chooses or elects a few people for salvation the moment that they're conceived, even before they're born, and that all others are simply damned to go to hell and to burn forever in the fires of hell. Now, this is the way he thought of human beings. Let's do a Venn diagram. He said you have a group called the elect. These are the ones that God has chosen to be saved. There's another group of the damned. Now, you'll notice two things about this diagram. First of all, there are a lot more damned than there are elect, a lot more headed for hell than for heaven. And the other thing is, there's no middle ground in this system. There's no purgatory. There's no halfway. You're in one group or the other. Now, if you believe passionately in predestination, and the Puritans did, they had a very urgent question: what group am I in? Now, the bad news is only God knows for sure. But there are signs of election, like praying, like reading the Bible, like going to church. And if you show these characteristics, then that's a very good sign, or they are signs that you may be chosen by God for salvation. Now, these are religious signs of election. But they would also be secularized. Now, that's a very important concept. Secular means not religious. Now, the Puritans needed to keep up appearances and to look for other signs of election. It didn't seem to be satisfying that if you just went to church and read the Bible, etc., that would prove that you were one of the chosen ones. They were looking for confirmation of that, for other signs. And the process of doing that meant that they looked to signs that were not religious. What was religious becomes non-religious. So even people who have never heard of John Calvin, who couldn't tell you what predestination means, are still influenced by this secularized or non-religious version of Calvinism. And that is very, very strong in American culture. Now, if God has already elected you from the moment of your conception, then what qualities are you likely to possess? Well, the Calvinists believed that, yes, you would read the Bible and go to church, etc., but there were also other qualities that you were likely to have. You would work hard. You would be thrifty, in other words, save your money. You would be sober and not drunk. You would take the initiative to gain control over your life.
You have a parent waiting at the
Sorry about that interruption. Now, if you practice these virtues like hard work, thrift, sobriety, etc., what is the frequent result? Well, very often it's material prosperity. You would do pretty well financially. So wealth itself is a virtue, according to this way of thinking. It's a sign that you were elect. Now, when you secularize this, you take the religious meaning out of it and you just say, you're one of the elect in society. Now, you're one of the chosen ones. Now, the Puritans were very worried about, whether they were elect or not. So they were always looking for more and more signs, and they wrote journals examining the events of their lives. For example, lightning struck my neighbor's barn and it burned down, but mine was spared through the grace of God. He must be favoring me. But if a year later lightning struck your barn and your barn burned down, then you would have questions about whether you were one of the elect. This made for a very nervous group of people, and a group of people who were concerned about keeping up appearances, looking good, because they lived in little towns in which everybody knew everybody else's business. So even if they weren't so sure whether they were among the elect, they wanted to look like it. Now, let's look at how this plays out in later American society. This is the view of wealth that we get in the Bible, in the New Testament. The famous line, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven," from the Gospel of Matthew. But by the late 19th and early 20th century, you had something like this. The Episcopal Bishop of Massachusetts, who said, in the long run, it is only to the man of morality that wealth comes. Godliness is in league with riches. So if you're wealthy, it must be because you're a moral person. This doesn't fit so well with the gospel. But this is an example of that idea of the elect and the damned, with no middle ground between them, becoming secularized. Now, I'll give you a few examples of people who secularized Calvinism. Ben Franklin was not a Calvinist, he was a deist. He wasn't even a Christian, really. And here's what he said: "It is the working man who is the happy man. It is the idle man who is the miserable man." Again, celebrating the value of hard work, coming right out of that Puritan mentality. Energy and persistence conquer all things. Remember, we talked about initiative as a Puritan value. Diligence is the mother of good luck. That, if you have good fortune, then it's because God has blessed you because you have done things the right way. Time is money. I am for doing good to the poor, but I differ in opinion about the means. I think the best way of doing good to the poor is not making them easy in poverty, but leading or driving them out of it. So if you're poor, chances are you're responsible for that. Okay, let's look at another secularizer here, Horatio Alger. Not a Calvinist. He was a Unitarian, which is nowhere near like Calvinism. He wrote more than 100 novels, which are sometimes described as rags to riches, and really just rags to respectability. The hero starts out terribly poor, but rises up to a comfortable status by the end of the book. Uh, he said in his most famous book, "I hope, my lad," Mr. Whitney said, "you will prosper and rise in the world. You know, in this free country, poverty is no bar to a man's advancement." So you separate the world into the good and the bad, the elect and the damned, and if you're on the wrong side of that, it's probably your fault. Well, we know that sometimes this is true, and very often it's not true. But according to Alger, don't just talk about luck, because luck comes to those who deserve it. Here's another one. Paul Ryan, former Speaker of the House. He's not a Calvinist, he's a Catholic. And Catholics and Calvinists don't agree with each other on much of anything, but when this Calvinist belief becomes secularized, then they sometimes do agree. And here's what Ryan said. He divided the country into the makers and the takers. The makers are the people who create wealth, and the takers are those who depend on the government. What if they're elderly? What if they're ill? He doesn't really address that too much. People who depend on the government are the takers, and the other people, the good guys, the elect, are the makers. This is right out of 17th century Puritanism. He said, we don't want to turn the safety net into a hammock that lulls able-bodied people into complacency and dependence. This is just like what Ben Franklin was writing in the late 18th century, 2 centuries earlier. Here's another secularizer of Calvinism, and in this case, he is a Calvinist. He was raised as a Presbyterian. But his signs of election are not religious. He's not an especially religious man. These are secular signs of election. I'll just simply give you some quotations from him, and you can decide whether he fits the pattern. My whole life is about winning. I don't lose often. I almost never lose. Notice here, you're dividing the world into 2 categories, into winners and losers. There's not much room for in-between in this way of thinking. Okay. He said about African Americans in Michigan during the campaign, you're living in poverty, your schools are no good, you have no jobs, 58% of your youth is unemployed. What the hell do you have to lose? Well, we know that there are all kinds of African Americans who do have jobs, who go to good schools, who don't live in poverty, but he sort of puts them into that either-or way of thinking. The beauty of me is that I'm very rich. Again, like the Episcopal bishop a century earlier, saying it's only to the man of morality that wealth comes. The point is, you can never be too greedy. And finally, we have a lot of really bad dudes in this country from outside. They go if I get elected. Gangs all over the place. And that's a basis for his dislike of immigrants. It's putting people into those categories of winners and losers, of elect and non-elect. So when we look at this Venn diagram that I showed you earlier, this was the religious version. But without changing the structure of the diagram, we can simply change the labels. Let's change these labels to rich and poor. Let's change them again to the workers and the unemployed. People are ashamed when they lose their jobs. It's a stigma, it's a mark against them. The native-born and immigrants. Nativism, or a dislike of immigrants, has become very strong in American culture, and this too is a reflection of Calvinism. But it's a secularized Calvinism. A lot of the people who believe these things have never heard of John Calvin, couldn't tell you to save their lives what predestination means as a theological theory. but they pick up these values. Unfortunately, white nationalism, white supremacy is a philosophy that is growing in this country, and it's becoming more and more common and more out in the open, where somehow white people are superior to non-white people. This is an especially ugly way that a secularized Calvinism shows up in modern-day America. And we have our own version. Now, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't cheer for the Cubs. Of course we should. But can you imagine people from other cultures being as obsessed with sports as we are? Can you imagine the Buddhists having an intense basketball rivalry with the Taoists? Doesn't really compute. Now, the Puritans had a version of the American dream, the ideal, future that Americans have looked forward to. Originally, when they came, their voyage to Massachusetts or to Plymouth was motivated by the religious well-being of their children, so that they would not be corrupted by the influences of the modern world in the Netherlands where they had been, or in Britain. They had a vision of a city on a hill, an ideal society, kind of utopian, which means an ideal society. That's the kind of civilization they were trying to create. And they also created an early version of American exceptionalism, the idea that America is different from other countries and better. They had the sense that they were in control of their own destiny, of how their lives would go. But originally it was as a community, and that started to become more and more individualistic over time. And in many ways, we are a very individualistic nation today. They were ambivalent toward a free market economy. Ambivalent means you're sort of torn in two directions at the same time. They thought that wealth was a sign of election. And when they could grow crops as individuals, they grew more of them. So this idea of free enterprise, a free market, was something very attractive to them. But they also recognized that materialism is evil, that if you're too obsessed with wealth, that's not a good thing. So their attitude toward the American dream was, as I said, ambivalent. They were torn about the idea. I hope this has given you an idea of how Puritanism has been carried over into modern America and has existed throughout American history. Be on the lookout for examples of this sort of thing. I suspect you will find many of them.